Evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to join you tonight and to speak about two great passions of mine, Pre-Raphaelite artists and also my home city of Oxford. And if Pre-Raphaelitism has a second city other than London, it most certainly would be Oxford. And how that came about, I'm going to talk about tonight, and talk about some of the principal artists of the Pre-Raphaelites who worked in Oxford, and some of their early patrons who really established the whole movement as really something that transformed British art in the mid-19th century. So we're going to take a look at many paintings that actually are still in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, the world's oldest public museum. Many of the photographs I've actually photographed myself within the museum, and I also have been taking photographs from other collections. I'm also sharing with you some of my own location photographs from places around the city where the Pre-Raphaelites painted. So our story begins tonight in 1846. With my previous talks, I've talked about the precocious genius who was John Everett Millais, born in 1829, the youngest ever entrant to the Royal Academy at the age of 12, a very proficient painter by 1846, when he exhibited his well-known work, the Pizarro Seizing the Inca of Peru. He was a model student at the Royal Academy. Now, in the summer of 1846, he visited his half-brother, Henry Hodgkinson, who lived in Oxford. And this really starts, in fact, this association with Oxford. Not at this time, Millais was not a Pre-Raphaelite by any means, or any stretch of means. He stayed up at Shotover Park. Now, Shotover Park is this large mansion near Wheatley. If you come in on the London Road into Oxford, you pass the border of Shotover Park. But the actual house, if you see in the bottom left-hand corner picture, is a large mansion, and it wasn't quite as large in Millais' time. The east and west wings were not as developed. There was a loggia at the one side, but it was a huge property. But unusually, it was only occupied by a very senior gentleman, Mr. Jury. And Mr. Jury and Millais and Millais' brother William Millais became quite friendly. And Mr. Jury allowed John Everett Millais to fish and shoot within the grounds of Shotover, and also Millais painted a little bit while he was at Shotover Park. And we believe that this painting, which is in Birmingham Art Gallery, is his earliest painting from the Oxford area, called The Gypsy. It shows nothing of a Pre-Raphaelite influence at all. At this stage, Millais, this is a very traditional watercolour, but does show some skill. Of course, Millais was only 16 years old or so when he painted that. And I also have this little pen sketch, which is printed in the Life and Letters of Sir John Everett Millais. And this is Mr. Jury and Mr. Millais take the air at Shotover Park. And now the date in the Life and Letters says 1848, but I believe it may be the summer beforehand. But anyway, this established Millais in Oxford and introduced him to this gentleman I've talked about before, Mr. James Wyatt, who was the famous frame maker and print seller and picture dealer within Oxford. And he lived at 115 The High in Oxford. The High here is depicted in Turner's great painting, which is in the Ashmolean Museum, one of the most famous views in England, really. We can see the spire of St. Mary Virgin Church, the Church of All Saints, which is now Lincoln College Library, and the tower at the very end is St. Martin's Church. So the city of Oxford is the city of dreaming spires, as we know, and this is a very beautiful view. Now, Wyatt's shop was on the same side as University College, which is on our left here in the Turner painting, and Wyatt's residence was there. And Wyatt's depicted here with his his granddaughter Sarah, and Millais met him through Drury, and Wyatt was an alderman within the city of Oxford, and indeed his family were well established in the city of Oxford. There's a portrait of Wyatt by John Bridges, an older artist from a few years before. I've even tracked down the little thing that's actually on Wyatt's table in his parlour. If you can look at him looking at a book, and you can see his little wooden box there. That's still a photograph of it. Now, Wyatt's garden was quite interesting. It was full of various monuments from Oxford that had decayed under with time, and the garden was full of various sculptures. And we get a lovely glimpse through of Wyatt's window into the back garden here in Oxford and some of his picture collection. It also is an interesting painting because this is 1849, around the formation of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And Millais is moving here from a more traditional portrait style, little portrait style, into something that is full of sunlight, full of light, and the view through the window gives an intimation of what was to come with Pre-Raphaelite painting. That is, painting truthfully from nature and looking at the subject in particular, and the details in this painting are absolutely wonderful. I showed this painting of Mrs. Eliza Wyatt, the daughter of James Wyatt, last time when I talked on Millais' portraits. But what I didn't show was this other painting that is less well known by Millais of the Wyatt children from 1849. And this painting here is again painted at the Wyatt residence with some of Wyatt's picture collection in the background. It seems somewhat naive, and there are certain problems of scale. In fact, it isn't a painting that is regularly featured in monographs on the Pre-Raphaelites because it is in a sort of transitional style. But the painting of Eliza Wyatt in the top left-hand corner, as I pointed out in my former talk on Millais, is in fact a very important painting because it shows him adopting this new style where figures are almost appear cut out. They're very conscious of the art of Hans Memling and Jan van Eyck, and there's a reference to Raphael in the print in the top left-hand corner of the painting. The Pre-Raphaelites were a London-based group from the Royal Academy schools, all young men, but Millais was the first one of their number to go up to Oxford and to paint there. And so he was the gateway for other artists who later on from the Pre-Raphaelites came to Oxford. And Millais came from a wealthy middle-class family, and in some ways he was very well connected and moved freely within social circles. So he was quite able to meet with the well-to-do people. And this enabled, particularly with someone like Wyatt, who was an alderman within Oxford, it enabled some really good connections. And Wyatt, in fact, purchased his painting, produced for the Royal Academy in 1847, but was rejected. His Simon and Finiglia was rejected, but in fact, Wyatt bought that painting from Millais. Now, just this is a little aside. This is a much later painting by John Everett Millais of Mr. James Wyatt Jr., the son of the gentleman in the parlour. And this painting now hangs in Oxford Town Hall, not in a non-Pre-Raphaelite style. Millais moved on from Pre-Raphaelitism, but this gives you an example of his later work. But it is a work by Millais, which is in the city of Oxford, so I thought I'd include it. It's actually skied on a wall in the town hall. But a good example of his later portraiture, and a painting that is less well known, I suppose. He also looks quite like his father, doesn't he? So we cut to the chase. We come to an important Pre-Raphaelite painting that has Oxford connections, and that is Millais' work of 1849, Ferdinand Lured by Ariel. Now, Millais had painted a smaller study for this painting as he was moving into a Pre-Raphaelite style. He had made a drawing from the subject from Tempest in Shakespeare with a shipwreck in the background, and you can see an indication of that in this painting with this ornate frame. But this was slightly around the time of the formation of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and there's nothing we could say that's really Pre-Raphaelite apart from perhaps the stance of Ferdinand in this smaller oil painting. And yet he moves into this new style with this Ferdinand Loeber aerial. This is a detail I've taken from it of his Pre-Raphaelite brother who is posing for Ferdinand, and this is F.G. Stevens, who was an important member of the group. And although he was a painter, but he was also known for his writings as well. And in a way, his writings are more important now than his paintings. He was a much inferior painter to John Everett Millais. And here is, in fact, the painting. And it was painted at Shotover. The background, indeed, was painted in the gardens at Shotover Park. And it is a painting that really attracted the attention, not least for the fact that botanists could spot 5 different types of grass on it was not. This is something that's incredibly different to the generalized sort of grass that one might see in another 19th century painting with just sweeps of impasto paint to indicate grass. No, Millais painted almost literally every single blade of grass. We have the fungi, we have the little robin in the willow, and this was all painted in the grounds at Shotover. And brilliantly done it is. Millais painted the figures and the figure of Ariel back in his studio at Gower Street in London. But this is the first Oxford background, and a delightful painting that can now be seen in the Tate Gallery. It is really his first manifesto work in Pre-Raphaelitism in going into nature. He painted his famous painting Isabella, but that is an interior. This is actually taking Ruskin's dictum of going to nature and painting from nature and letting nature communicate with the artist and the artist responding to it. And there was no artist other than Hunt who really worked in this way in such a fastidious technique at this early stage. But soon this was to inspire a whole generation of British artists going out into the countryside and painting. And of course, it's a laborious technique, painted into a wet white background, emulating fresco, so that the colours really, really glow brightly. Now, I introduce the other second and probably an even more important figure than Wyatt, and this is Thomas Combe, who of the Clarendon Press in Oxford was an extremely important figure in the encouragement and patronage of the early Pre-Raphaelites. Now, Thomas Combe lived in Walton Street at the Oxford University Press buildings. We can go visit his garden today in Walton Street, where Millais painted, and indeed he painted this rather wonderful portrait here. It was painted in 4 2-hour sittings. There's a little label on the back of this painting, which is now in the Ashmolean Museum. Now, if you want you to notice this heraldic shield in the top left-hand corner, and this is the Combe crest. However, it isn't in fact Thomas Combe's crest, but that of John Combe, who is in the monument, who was a friend of William Shakespeare at Holy Trinity Church in Stratford. And this tomb is quite near Shakespeare's monument in Stratford upon Avon. But Combe, who had an interest in heraldry, seemed to be okay about this being a sort of a light-hearted joke, and it was also a Pre-Raphaelite thing to put up a shield up in the corner. It was a sort of archaic device that appeared a lot in Tudor portraiture and in portraiture of the 16th and 17th centuries. So in a way, it was responding to that. And indeed, in Collins' portrait of Mr. Bennet too, which is also in the Ashmolean Museum, we find a heraldic shield. And Combe's collection of shields are also at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. But I think this is a delightful portrait of Thomas Combe. This is before he grew his beard, which was probably 2 or 3 years later. Combe was known as the early Christian by the group of the Pre-Raphaelites because of his great Christian faith and also his interest in the Tractarian movement, which was taking place in Oxford at the time. And at this time, he was also a great benefactor of St. Paul's Church in Walton Street near his house. But I like this portrait too because of the cat on his lap. The head is somewhat large, and this is something that you notice in some of 15th century portraits by people like Memling or van der Weyden. So Millet is in a sense tipping his cap to those artists too. So here is Thomas Combe in the top right-hand corner after he'd grown his beard. This is a drawing by William Holman Hunt of Thomas Combe, and this shows the inner courtyard of Clarendon Press and the Oxford University Press, where Combe worked. And there is a contemporary print of the Oxford University printing house from the Radcliffe Infirmary. This is where Combe worked, and Combe amassed a huge fortune, and this enabled him to both purchase great paintings, but also he was very good, like many Victorian philanthropists, towards the people who worked there, and it enabled him to eventually finance the building of St Barnabas Church. This was a very important purchase by Combe. Now, Charles Alston Collins was a good friend of John Everett Millais, and in the summer of 1850, they both worked in Oxford together. Initially, both Millais and Collins stayed in Botley, and they had a rather a landlady that they made a lot of, who they were quite afraid of, and there was a lot of sort of jokes were made about her. But eventually, Combe invited Collins and Millais to stay with him. Millais found staying in Botley quite convenient because he was painting at White and Woods at the time, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But the foreground of this painting was all painted at the Clarendon Press, and how beautiful it is. This is Convent Thoughts, which is by Collins, who was not a formal member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, but had entirely adopted their principles. The frame itself is designed by John Everett Millais. The Latin translates as "like a lily," and it refers to the Canticles, the Song of Solomon, that my beloved is like a garden enclosed. Of course, it alludes to the Virgin Mary, and if we notice the nun's hand, one of her fingers is pointing down in the missal to a page which depicts the Holy Virgin, and on the other page she points to a page of illuminated manuscript which depicts Christ's crucifixion. The nun is contemplating a passion flower which closely resembles the nails of the crucifixion. And so the different types of lily are also the arum lily, which is connected with Gabriel's announcement of the birth of Christ. So all the flowers, as in Victorian painting we talked about before, are symbolic and are pertinent to the subject matter itself. But a beautiful painting with the reflection in the water below, indicating this nun's reflection in her spiritual meditations. So it had this dual meaning, really. And Ruskin did defend this painting, not possibly for its Roman Catholic tendencies, but because of its ultimate truth to nature and its veracity. It is incredibly detailed, and I'm just going to show you a detail here of the water lilies. I've taken this close up at about, and it should render on a computer screen almost exactly the size, and you will notice that absolutely even the tiny little daisies in the ground, the water lilies are painted. These are not Claude Monet type water lilies. These are painted with a tiny little sable brush, and probably it would take a whole day to have painted one of these lilies or one of these goldfish below, but beautifully painted. And Collins worked in this laborious technique, very similar to that of his great friend John Everett Millais, who he was now very much under the sway of. So we move on. Sorry, just going to move on. At the same time as Convent Thoughts, while staying in Botley, Millais began work on his first major painting out of doors, apart from Ferdinand Loubet Ariel, The Woodman's Daughter. Now, The Woodman's Daughter was based on a poem by the poet Coventry Patmore, The Woodman's Daughter, as it was originally published. And it depicts, as so often the Victorian paintings do, this unequal relationship, or a burgeoning unequal relationship, between the young squire, Gerald, and the woodman's daughter, Maud. And there's the woodman looking in the drawing, as you can see, over at his daughter and the young squire. Of course, in this stage, as children, this is an entirely innocent, they're not aware of their social positions and rank. But this story is, if one reads through Patmore's poem, is a very tragic story, one that ends up in madness and indeed the drowning of the illegitimate child of Maud from Gerald. Now, the piece of poetry that went with it, the poem was, she went merely to think she helped, and whilst he hacked and sawed, the rich squire's son, a young boy then, whole mornings, as if awed, stood silent by and gazed in turn at Gerald and on Maud. He sometimes in a sullen tone, he offered fruits, and she received them, always with an air so unreserved and free, that shamefaced distance soon became familiarity. And indeed it did. And the poem goes on to tell of this fated relationship that would result in an illegitimate child that would eventually be drowned and cause Maud's madness. And so, rather like his painting of Christ in the house of his parents, acted out by children, it would prefigure what would happen as adults. Now, I also have included a painting acquired by the Ashmolean Museum that very summer, Uccello's The Forest Hunt. And it is said that the costumes from this are replicated in Millet's painting, The Woodman's Daughter. And one can see that by the stiff angularity of the figures in Uccello painting and that of the squire in Millet's painting. Here I've taken a photograph in White Wood, very close to the spot where Millet painted A Woodman's Daughter. Part of my work as an artist is actually seeking out places where well-known artists have painted. And so with the help of a doctor at White Wood from Oxford University, we managed to locate the probable woodland site of where Millet painted A Woodman's Daughter. And I can't say that that's the exact tree, but I can say that it's in the part of the wood where Millet painted. And you can see that the vegetation is very similar, although some of the fir trees in the background are now no longer there. But the painting itself, as you can see on the right, is in the Guildhall Art Gallery in London. Now, there is a difference between this and the drawings I showed you before, because it is the woodman has now turned his back on Gerald and Maud. And that's significant. We also notice that the axe is featuring, the shining axe reflects the green of the wood. And at the feet of Gerald, we have the jay's feather, which is mentioned in the opening lines of the poem. This took Millet considerable time to paint, and he scrubbed it out a number of times to get it right. So fastidious were the Pre-Raphaelites to get things right that he did in fact get this jay's feather right. And it also has a symbolic thing about the two jay's feathers that have fallen in the tragedy which would unfold. I was also provided with maps of White Woods in the 18th century, and so I also went to the Gardener's Lodge where Millet stored his painting. That's the little house on the right, and I've been in there. I've seen where Millet stored his work just by Whiteham Abbey, that is on the Abingdon estate, and I've also located the probable spot of A Woodman's Daughter in the bottom red arrow. And that was a stand of trees that was about 80 years old by the time Millet was painting it in that summer. So very, very accurately painted, and still a recognisable spot today. And a beautiful woodland owned by the university for the study of particularly of trees. And the BBC did a series a few years back on a famous oak tree, which stands in White Woods And you have to get a university pass to actually walk in these woods, but I do suggest it's a beautiful place to go. And if you want to sort of almost believe at this this time of year, if I walk in Whiteton Woods, I can't help but think of this painting. And here is a drawing by another Pre-Raphaelite influenced artist of Coventry, Patmore, the poet. You possibly might know the better painting by John Singer Sargent in the National Portrait Gallery when he is full of whiskers and grey hair, but this is more about how he would have looked to Millet when the Pre-Raphaelites set out. And Coventry Patmore was quite an advocate for the Pre-Raphaelites in this early stage, indeed wrote to Ruskin about them. And there is a picture of Mrs. Patmore, one by John Brett, which hangs in the Ashmolean Museum, and the other one of Mrs. Coventry Patmore by Millet, almost of the same date as the woman's daughter. The painting is in the Fitzwilliam Museum, and in fact is a little bit smaller than when Millet painted it because it's been cut down a little bit, which is rather unfortunate, but it shows Millet's approach, similar to the Combe portrait, a face on view, and it shows this intense gaze that the Pre-Raphaelite artists at this epoch were engaged in. There's nothing broad about this. Every little hair is painted, the lace is perfectly painted, and a little posy painted beautifully. It's also framed in a similar frame to that of the Return of the Dove to the Ark, and whether it indeed is the same frame moulding, I'm not sure. Now, whilst at Thomas Coombs, Millet would often discuss his new paintings, and we're lucky to have lots of the letters between Thomas Combe and John Everett Millet. And Millet, who had painted his famous painting Isabella, was now determined to paint a really important subject picture based on the great flood of Noah. And this one was to be that moment talked about in the Gospels, that the people, as in the days of the flood, that life was going along, but the flood would come upon people suddenly. And so here we have the working drawing for the eve of the deluge, which was going to be Millet's great work. And he discussed this in a number of letters to both Holman Hunt and to Thomas Combe. And it looked like it was going to be an absolutely wonderful painting. It's all squared up. This drawing is in the British Museum. The view out the window is in fact flooded ground at Godstow Meadow, which those who know Oxford is in the north part of Oxford near Wolvercote. And it was to be a really remarkable painting, but it never was actually painted. Millet abandoned the idea really for want of time. The Pre-Raphaelite paintings at this stage took a long time to paint, and so he did not do that. But it was a familiar subject to many Victorians. There's the Deluge as painted by Francis Danby, a great Victorian painter, in the top left. Here's a nice little sketch by Collins of one of those evenings where they were discussing something like the painting of the flood. This is a sketch by Collins in Combes' living room with Maud and with Martha Combe and Thomas Combe, with Millet, who's there. You can see him sitting at the foot of the table, and that's a nice one. There's a parody here by Millet of Saint Carlo, which is, Carlo was the colloquial name for Charles Alston Collins, because Collins had become very, very religious, becoming quite Catholic, and Millet would, who was not particularly religious, would often sort of needle Collins a little bit in their friendship about this and that. And so he referred to him as Saint Carlo. And there is a parody cartoon by Millet of Collins painting at his easel and a nun kneeling beneath the easel. But Millet too did actually paint a painting about the great flood of Noah, but he painted really just a reduced version. But what a wonderful one it is. It's the Return of the Dove to the Ark. So here it depicts that passage in Genesis where the dove brings a sprig of olive and to let those who are on board the ark know that the flood waters were abating. And as a painting, the straw is marvelously painted. It has an unusually dark background for a Pre-Raphaelite painting, but originally Noah was going to be included in the background, but just the two wives of the sons of Noah are included in this painting. And there's a lovely drawing for it too on the right, which is in Montreal, which I photographed. But absolutely beautiful painting, known for its masterful study of drapery. Also, the two women are not they're not beautiful, not classically beautiful, and this was something the Pre-Raphaelites often did. They painted common people, but in a very in a way that was really intense, and so it brings out a sort of realism to it, which just didn't exist in Victorian art up to this point. Indeed, if you can see that in the painting of the woman daughter as well. This painting by Collins, The Devout Childhood of Saint Elizabeth, Hungary, was also painted just about the same time as Millet's Return of the Dove. And I want you to know, because it is in fact the same model, and it would appear the same gown is almost on The Devout Childhood of Saint Elizabeth. This painting on the left is in Detroit, and you also might notice, the eagle-eyed among you, they both have the same frame as well. And so that's quite interesting to see. So these artists work closely together. I can't prove exactly where the background is in the Collins painting, but it could possibly be an Oxford background. And certainly there is a closeness between these two works. And it'd be quite fun one day if the two were brought together and you could examine just how close these two artists were at this particular time in their evolution. Also painted in Coombs' back garden, looking out the window, is the very well-known Pre-Raphaelite painting, which was exhibited in the Royal Academy of 1851, Mariana, and it quotes lines from Tennyson, Tennyson's poem Mariana, which is based on the character of Mariana from Shakespeare's Measure for Measure. It quoted with the lines, "She only said, 'My life is dreary, he cometh not,' she said. She said, 'I am weary, a-weary, I would that I were dead.'" It is Tennyson's poem that inspired Millet in this painting. The Tennyson poem talks of her rejection by her fiancé Angelo after her dowry was lost in a shipwreck. And she leads a lonely existence in a moated grange, and she is still in love with Angelo, who is now the deputy to the Duke of Vienna, and longs to be reunited with him. So this painting is all about longing, and here she works on a tapestry, similar to the tapestries that appear in Rossetti's paintings of the Virgin Mary. And here the indications of time passing, the leaves, the autumn leaves falling across the floor, the scurrying mouse, her devotion to the Virgin at the table in the back, her looking out at these stained glass windows. We can see in the earlier drawing for it that idea wasn't so fully developed at the early stage. But these windows too are interesting because they aren't in Thomas Coombs' house in Walton Street, but indeed these windows are taken from the windows in Merton College Chapel. Now, those of us who are fortunate enough to live in Oxford know that Merton College Chapel is blessed with some of the finest medieval glass in the whole country. And in 1850, scaffolders were up in Merton College, up in the lights of the great window in Merton College Chapel. And Millet was able to get up there and paint these two figures representing Gabriel and Mary, the Annunciation. And these are included in the painting Mariana. So let's just go back and look at it. And that's how Millet interpreted those two windows. And I'm thankful to my friend Aidan for photographing those at close quarters. And you can see how it was lovely that the Pre-Raphaelites are referencing not Italian art, not Netherlandish art, but they're referencing British stained glass art. And that's a rather lovely thing. And that appears in Mariana. At the same time, Hunt was painting his wonderful painting, which is now in the collection of the Ashmolean Museum, thanks to Thomas Combe, who also purchased this along with The Return of the Dove to the Ark and Convent Thoughts. I've spoken about this painting before, but this painting, which was initially inspired by a Royal Academy competition, An Act of Mercy, that is, Hunt responded to it in a Christian sense, in that it is a Christian family sheltering a priest who has been injured by the Druids, who are persecuting, and you can see a missionary running away from them in the background. The missionary is in the Pieta pose, as is Christ in the arms of Mary, and we can notice all sorts of symbols which allude to the passion of Christ. And indeed, everything in the Pre-Raphaelite paintings, as I've explained before, is symbolic. So we have a little bowl of water on the ground, which has so recently been used to baptize this Christian family. It was said by Hunt that this painting was to represent the civilizing influence of Christianity, and indeed the Christianizing of Britain. At this stage, they thought that the Druids were entirely pagan, and this was a view that was held in Victorian England. And although it is not known that the Druids actually persecuted Christian missionaries in this particular way. The shelter is, of course, similar to those that was understood to be the very early Christian shelters and churches. And we can see it's a rudimentary structure. The net that hangs on the other side by the silver birch is the net which represents I will make you fishers of men, Christ's words, and also the kingdom of heaven is like a net. The corn is symbolic of the Eucharist, the bread, and the vine is symbolic of the wine. So one can read the painting much as you can read a tract. And indeed, that's very, very important when we come on to consider this next slide. In the top left-hand corner, we have Rogier van der Weyden's Pieta, which is a possible influence upon the Hunt painting. We also have the very controversial painting of Christ in the house of his parents, the carpenter's shop, which I spoke about the other week. But I wanted to bring these in because these paintings bring us something very specifically to Oxford. The figure in the bottom left-hand corner is John Henry Newman, whose powerful sermons in Oxford during the late 1830s and early 1840s, and the tracts of the Tractarian movement, of which Michael has spoken about, were enormously important in Oxford, and indeed formed much of the Christian debate within the university and within the city of Oxford. And indeed, it was a sermon at the university church, obviously not by Newman, who had converted to Catholicism by this time, but which was said to have inspired Millet to paint Christ in the house of his parents. I think also Holman Hunt and Combe play a significant part in helping, in a sense, inspiring Millet to go a step beyond with symbolism within Christ in the house of his parents, which indeed has been said can be interpreted similar to a Tractarian pamphlet on altar. And so there are lots of parallels between this period of Pre-Raphaelite painting and some of the work of the Tractarians, particularly Pusey. Perhaps the most famous Christian painting of all, and particularly of all the Pre-Raphaelites, is The Light of the World. And this was painted not in Oxford, but it has come to Oxford and is probably the most well-known painting in the city of Oxford. It now is in Keble College Chapel, and it represents Christ at the door of the human heart knocking. And it was painted in an orchard at Ewell in Surrey, near Epsom, close to where the backgrounds of Ophelia and the Hireling Shepherd were painted at night, but as the dawn was approaching, so symbolizing that Christ would bring in the dawn. It was painted in a cold time of the year, so a very unpromising time of the year to start painting a picture like this, with the apples falling on the ground and wasted. They're all symbolic of humankind's fall, and the light illuminating the ground. And you can see here is the lamp that Hunt had made for this particular painting, which is in 3 versions. There's a small version finished by Frederick George Stevens at Manchester Art Gallery. And also there, of course, is the much later version, which is in St Paul's Cathedral. But if you do come to Oxford, in Keble College, in the Combe bequest, Martha Combe bequested this painting to Keble College, where it has its own chapel, where it can be admired and viewed to this very day. And it's a wonderful painting, but nothing like the size of the one in St Paul's Cathedral. It has become almost like a Protestant icon, as they say, and the version from St Paul's Cathedral travelled around the world at the beginning of the 20th century, and is possibly one of the best known modern Christian paintings because of its symbolic content. And it spoke profoundly to Hunt as well. As he was painting it, he underwent a conversion experience of sorts himself, which inspired him to go out to Palestine to paint authentic backgrounds to his biblical subjects. Now here is William Holman Hunt again, a painting I haven't shown you before, a portrait of the Reverend John David Jenkins of Jesus College. Now Jenkins was known as the Railmen's Apostle, and he was at St Paul's Church in Jericho, which was Thomas Combe's church. There's a little photograph of the interior of St Paul's Church. Now St Paul's Church in Walton Street, near Thomas Combe's, is in fact now is a restaurant, Freud's restaurant, but it's a neoclassical building, so it didn't fully accord with the way Combe would really want a church interior to be. Although it is said that Hunt and Millet did work on the apse, but there's nothing existing in the apse that can absolutely verify that. 2 railway lines came into Oxford. We have the station coming in from Grand Pont, and then we have the GWR station and the branch which came out at the Rewley branch. And so Jenkins was part of this movement, which is the Tractarian movement. And here he is painted by William Holman Hunt. And this painting is in the Fellows room at Jesus College in Oxford. And a very fine portrait it is. It shows something of the cloister there, and you can just make out some of the ivy growing through the cloister. But a fine piece of Pre-Raphaelite portraiture, painted in 1852. Now Thomas Combe went on to pay for, in 1869, the Church of St Barnabas in Jericho. And I cite this here because St Barnabas Church, and maybe Michael will talk about this later, was based upon the Basilica in Torcello in Venice, but it is an absolutely stunning interior. It in fact, perhaps the rendering outside is weathered a little, and but this church was for the people of Jericho, and it shows something of Thomas Combe's great philanthropy, really. And the inside was never fully finished, but there's some lovely quasi Pre-Raphaelite mosaics on the north-facing wall in there, and a church well worth visiting, and really beautiful. Italianate, unusual because we don't have too many churches in Britain with a campanile. We have the wonderful one at Wilton, but there are not so many churches according to this design, and it's one of Oxford's main churches. We've often talked about John Ruskin. Ruskin had come to the defence of the Pre-Raphaelites, and Ruskin, of course, was associated with many of the intellectuals of Oxford University. Ruskin himself was able to draw wonderfully, and I've just included this drawing, which is in the collection of the Ashmolean Museum, which is drawn from the same spot as Millet's great Ruskin portrait, again, Finglas, which I've talked about a number of times before, so I'm not going to talk about this too much tonight. Just to say that Ruskin was a critic, was fundamentally a critic who also was a wonderful painter, watercolorist and draftsman. And that example there of the Nice rock there, wonderfully demonstrates that he didn't just criticize other artists, he could surpass them in his skill of observation. And he certainly almost gives Millais a run for his money in that particular drawing, which is in a marvelous drawing, which is in the print room at the Ashmolean Museum. Now, Ruskin's influence upon the artistic life of Oxford, and indeed the enduring presence of Oxford and the Pre-Raphaelite movement, is fundamental, really. Ruskin went on really to inspire a whole generation of artists to move to a vision of nature which was in accord with his great dictums in modern painters, and no more so than the artist John William Inchbold. Now, Inchbold's paintings, there we have two wonderful examples at the Ashmolean Museum. This particular one, Early Spring, is one that was highly praised by Ruskin, and we can see why, because it adopts the Pre-Raphaelite principle of going to nature with a singleness of heart and selecting nothing, rejecting nothing. It's painted in full sunlight. You've got beautiful shadows. It's almost photographic, and yet it goes beyond the photograph in its intensity. And Inchbold, his early paintings of the 1850s into the early 1860s have this intensity. He sort of lost heart as Ruskin's support for him waned slightly, and this was unfortunate, because Inchbold's early work certainly rivals any of the other Pre-Raphaelites, and we can see this in the Ashmolean Museum collection. Another painting which features Thomas Combe is London Bridge at Night, on the marriage of the Prince and Princess of Wales, and this is by Holman Hunt. And this is and if we look at the little square on the right, I've taken a detail, and in the lower left of that pane, you can see Thomas Combe, now with his beard and top hat, in the crowd. No social distancing going on here on London Bridge that night. It is one of Hunt's first paintings where he really shows an interest, a continuing interest in nighttime scenes and artificial light. And this is a theme that I talked about when I was talking about Holman Hunt's work specifically. But this painting too is in the Ashmolean Museum, and we're very fortunate to have this, and we can compare the changes of the techniques of the Pre-Raphaelites as we go through the years. So this painting from the 1860s, but Hunt really remained the true Pre-Raphaelite throughout his life. The influence of Ruskin certainly extended well beyond that painting, and it extended into the life of what was to come Oxford University's Museum of Natural History, which was to play such a fundamental part in the development, the intellectual development of Victorian England. And for the building of this new museum, which was begun in 1855, the principal architect was Benjamin Woodward, an Irish architect, and here is a sculpture ahead of him by Alexander Munro, who was a sculptor follower, often associated with the Pre-Raphaelites. He wasn't a Pre-Raphaelite, but his work is often thought of as quasi-Pre-Raphaelite, in that he was a good friend of Thomas Woolner, the Pre-Raphaelite. And Woodward's design was really Gothic in many ways, and in fact looked to incorporate some of the Ruskin's ideas about looking at nature and incorporating some of the great craftsmanship that one observes in cathedrals of the Middle Ages. And certainly the interior and even indeed the exterior of the Oxford University Museum it's one of the most glorious buildings within Oxford, one of the best Victorian buildings, because it shows this wonderful attention to detail. Lots of different stones are used, and Woodward also at this particular time was also engaged on the new building of the library at the Oxford Union. And this is the library of the Oxford Union. This is no longer the debating chamber of the Oxford Union, which is an adjacent building, but in that summer, when the University Museum was begun, the Pre-Raphaelite artists in the summer of 1856 were working on these paintings, which are in the top part of the library. Now, these paintings have sadly decayed considerably, and there have been various attempts to restore them, not wholly successful. Part of the problem is that they're painted on to walls onto a distemper, which has sucked out some of the paint, and they've flaked and they've become unstable. Not least because possibly Dante Gabriel Rossetti was not the greatest technician. Certainly he had never painted anything fresco-like before, so he painted in a sort of watercolory technique into the plaster. However, they are a marvellous cycle of paintings. Having said that, and look at the roll call of artists who are working on them. We have Dante Gabriel Rossetti, William Morris, who later on went on to repaint the ceiling here. So this is all William Morris ceiling. William Morris, a student who had just graduated from Exeter College with Burne-Jones. And these were repainted in the 1880s, the ceiling. But he worked on this, on paintings on this. Edward Burne-Jones, of course, a very late, much painter we're going to consider in a minute. Arthur Hughes, who was perhaps technically the most skilled artist at the time working on these, and he painted, his skill was, you can see, and it comes through actually in his portion of the painting. Val Prinsep, who later was become a very important in the Holland Park set of Victorian artists. Spencer Stanhope, William Revere, and Britton Revere, who was also a very important Victorian artist. So this is Woodward's building here. And you can notice in the stanchions, it's very, very close almost to the design of the Oxford University Museum of Natural History too, and rightly so, because they're by the same architect. This is Rossetti's design for one portion of his fresco. This is Sir Lancelot's vision of the Holy Grail. Now, Ruskin praised Rossetti's work in watercolour because not because of its truth to nature, but because of its going back to a medieval art form, and in fact working with these jewel-like colours in the spirit of the Middle Ages. And in here, this is a lovely little painting, and the figure of Sir Lancelot is in fact that of William Morris, and the figure of Guinevere is in fact a lady who is to appear in so many Pre-Raphaelite paintings, that of Jane Burden, later Jane Morris, who was to become a very important figure in Pre-Raphaelite art. Certainly in Rossetti's art, she appears as his muse. This gives you an example of one of the artists employed on the Oxford Union murals. This is Arthur Hughes. Now, Arthur Hughes was something of a disciple of Millais in that he was a highly skilled painter, and this painting too has come into the Ashmolean collection in Oxford. A very fine painting it is, quite sentimental in some ways. It's called Home from Sea, and it depicts the return of a young sailor boy to find that his mother has died whilst he's been away. I talked about this painting when I was talking about the Victorian painters of that particular period. But it gives you an example of the skill of Arthur Hughes, who was employed on the murals. And back to the University Museum again. In the interior of the museum, we have some of the finest capitals that you're ever going to find in the 19th century, and they were carved under Benjamin Woodward's instruction to James O'Shea, and both Dr. Ackland, the Regius Professor at Oxford University, a great friend of John Ruskin, and John Ruskin dictated really what should go on within the University Museum within the interior. And so each column is a different type of rock, and each capital is carved. They're not mechanically carved like the Gilbert Scott ones in churches all around the country. These are from a Pre-Raphaelite principle, looking at nature, looking at leaves, and much as the medieval craftsmen, say somewhere about Southwell Minster would have done. And so they're beautiful pieces of carving, and they were done by the Irish stonemason James O'Shea. Now, James O'Shea, these capitals, and indeed the work on the front of the museum, was done by public subscription. So if you go to the entrance of the museum, you'll notice that in fact they aren't finished, and he left the project. Some say that O'Shea left the project under a cloud because he started, because he wasn't paid on time, he started carving cats and monkeys which resembled various dons. from the university. I can't say whether that's true or not, but of course this was the place where the great debate of 1860 took place between Bishop Wilberforce and Huxley on Darwin's Origin of Species. So a vastly important building, but a pre-Raphaelite building in many ways, that housed this temple of nature. It's also said that people like Ruskin went with the idea that nature was the second book of God, second to the Holy Bible. It was nature itself that spoke of God, and therefore what better place for this debate to take place and the intellectual argument between that of the theory of evolution and that of what had been handed down through theological teaching or church teaching through the centuries, as understood at that time. Unfortunately, hidden from us at the Oxford University Museum is this rather lovely painting on the left, also painted to Ruskin's principles from Glacier, and this is in the museum director's office. Now he's not a household name. Tyrwhitt is in fact an artist who probably painted from drawings rather than, he didn't paint on the spot because these are huge paintings, but these are in the University Museum. John Brett did, however, go out to Switzerland and paint this painting of a glacier with Ruskin. And so we can see that these are carried on throughout the whole museum. And indeed, the sculptures that adorn the museum of the great scientists of from right the way back to Francis Bacon and Linnaeus stand around the forecourt of the interior courtyard of the museum. And we even have the famous sculpture of Darwin himself. Thomas Woolner, one of the Pre-Raphaelite brothers, did 7 of the great scientist sculptures. Here's one of Francis Bacon, a very, very fine sculpture it is. What distinguishes Woolner's work as a Pre-Raphaelite is his attention to detail. Look at the ruff painted on Bacon there. And certainly Woolner, I wouldn't say is in the first rank of sculptors, but he did try to apply Pre-Raphaelitism to sculpture. Woolner is, of course, depicted in this painting by on the right here by Ford Madox Brown, The Last of England, where he is leaving for Australia. His early work didn't sell, and he had to go out to Australia. But fortunately, he came back. He also was quite a successful dealer in Pre-Raphaelite paintings as well. And later on in his life, he became a teacher of sculpture and a professor of sculpture at the Royal Academy, and retained something of a relationship with John Everett Millais. William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones are two of what we call the second phase of Pre-Raphaelitism. And William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones studied divinity at Exeter College. And now William Morris at this stage hadn't really made he had just started as an artist. He was very inspired by both Millais and particularly Dante Gabriel Rossetti in a sense of design. So he worked on the Oxford frescoes. But here he is. This is his only finished oil painting of Queen Guinevere. And you notice in the painting, which is in the Tate Gallery, his wonderful attention to detail and his sense of pattern. So whilst he may not be in top rank as an oil painter, we do notice that he has adopted a Pre-Raphaelite principle, and that extended, of course, in his later life to his the Kelmscott Press and his illuminations of the Kelmscott Chaucer. William Morris is probably one of the hardest working people of the whole Victorian period, in that he was constantly designing and he was writing poetry, translating from the Icelandic. He was a polymath, and it shows you what a great oil painter he could have been had he continued with that. But he went on to form the Morrison Company, where formed around his work, and we know, and we'll probably later on in this series be looking at the Red House and some of his work there. There is painting Jane Burden, who was later to be his wife, and here she is, but depicted here as Persephone by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, And of course, we know something of the scandal, the relationship with Dante Gabriel Rossetti and what was then Mrs. Morris. Now, Jane Burden came from Oxford. She lived in St Helens Passage off Holywell Street. And she was the daughter of a farrier, I believe, and sort of was of a different class, really. But she was spotted by Rossetti and Morris, and she became the archetypal muse for the Pre-Raphaelites. She did, as you can see from this photo, this wonderful photograph by Cameron, she did have this beautiful long neck and had these lovely locks, which are so much when we think of a Pre-Raphaelite painting by Rossetti, we think of Jane Burden, and we think of that wistful beauty, that world that is both mysterious and alluring and dangerous, and that's all Dante Gabriel Rossetti. So here we are in Persephone with the light returning as she returns from the underworld, and you can see the pomegranate in her hand. This was in a number of versions, but she became the great muse for Rossetti, and innumerable paintings by the latter phase of Pre-Raphaelitism depict Jane Morris. And she stayed out at Kelmscott Manor, which is not a great distance from Oxford. For those of you who live in Oxford or know Oxfordshire, it's about 20 miles from Oxford. One can visit William Morris's place at Kelmscott, which is well worth visiting. And there's a wonderful painting by Rossetti there, The Blue Closet. Pre-Raphaelitism really developed considerably throughout the 1860s. And no less an artist as Frederick Sands. He came from the Norfolk. He developed a style of Pre-Raphaelitism which amalgamated something of a classical stature. This almost looks like classical sculpture, like someone by Woolner. It also links a little bit in with Millet's Apple Blossom Spring. But it takes on to this new aestheticism that was beginning to appear within Pre-Raphaelite art. Sands was a wonderful draftsman, and there's an example of his sanguine drawing. He drew everything really fastidiously. In fact, he came into the Pre-Raphaelite movement as a result of looking at Millet's making a Cerism Brass at the Ford, and he made a parody of that, an etching parody of that particular painting, which was considered by Ruskin as a fall from grace, really. And he fell under Ruskin's spell as well. So we can see in the depiction of the flowers and the plants here in the foreground that they are in Pre-Raphaelite style and detail. And this painting too is a chief example of Pre-Raphaelitism, which is now in the Pre-Raphaelite room in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And his work is well worth seeing. Part of that room also we have this wonderful cabinet here, which is Edward Burne-Jones's first major piece of work, but it's not a painting, it's a cabinet, and it depicts the Prioress's Tale. It's rather an awkward thing to actually depict in a way, because it has the Prioress's Tale, as readers of Chaucer will know, has certain medieval anti-Semitic tropes to it, but it is nevertheless a wonderful piece of painting, and it adopts a medievalism that was to become almost a touchstone for the later Pre-Raphaelite work, particularly people like William de Morgan, and certainly Burne-Jones himself looked to this. And this piece of furniture is part of the Ashmolean Museum collection now. It's gilded as well, and as you can see here in the top right-hand corner, we also have an early Burne-Jones painting, which is in Lady Margaret Hall. And if you go into the chapel there, you can find an earlier Burne-Jones painting, and it's worth seeking ones out like that, because we might know the later work by Burne-Jones, but some of the earlier work is charming. It's very much more under Rossetti's influence. William Morris was colloquially known as Topsy, and Edward Burne-Jones was known as Ned. And there they are depicted by Max Beerbohm at the bottom there. But the great friendship continued, and as expressed in the wonderful windows that we see all around the country. But if you're looking for Pre-Raphaelite windows in Oxford, you don't need to go much further than Christ Church Cathedral in Oxford, or indeed Harris Manchester Chapel in Oxford. You'll find a fine sequence of Morris Company glass there, Burne-Jones windows. This is a wonderful window in Oxford Cathedral, one of his earlier windows actually, and this is in Oxford Cathedral. And just to show, this is a painting of Georgina Burne-Jones and her children, 1883. Burne-Jones's style is very, very distinct. There's this great sense of melancholy and loss within Burne-Jones's work. I may do a talk on Burne-Jones at some time, so I'm not going to talk too much about him tonight, but just to say that he is an artist of great importance and great significance in the development of the transition from Pre-Raphaelitism into European symbolism. And he's an artist who is much admired in Europe. And in fact, the young Pablo Picasso, Blue Period, was influenced to some extent by Burne-Jones's work. So he's a highly important artist internationally as well, and very much appreciated in France. Now, other artists working in Oxford at the time, as we know, Oxford is a fascinating place, and Binsey near Oxford is the site of St Margaret's Well, the treacle wells as spoken of by Lewis Carroll. And there's a wonderful illustration of Alice by John Tenniel, the great Victorian book illustrator. But in the top left-hand corner is also a painting of Binsey near the treacle wells, and that was painted by an artist called George Price Boyce. Now, he is an artist who adopted Ruskin's principles, and he painted Pre-Raphaelite landscapes. And many of his landscapes are painted along the Thames, or near the Thames, and here he is painting near Oxford at Binsey. And this is a wonderful piece of Pre-Raphaelite landscape painting. I would also encourage you to look at George Price Boyce's works, paintings of Maple Durham and of Whitchurch, where he is painted along the River Thames, and he paints in this exquisite Pre-Raphaelite style. Pre-Raphaelites are also quite good friends with Lewis Carroll as well, and indeed Lewis Carroll photographed some of the Millais family as well. And we have photographs of by Dodgson of Mary Millais and Alice Millais in the collection. Dodgson was of course a fine photographer as well as a mathematician and obviously a writer of Alice in Wonderland, which is all taking place at the same time as this was going on. So here we are. Here's Ruskin back in Oxford, and here he is with the painter William Bell Scott, and on his arm Dante Gabriele Rossetti. And William Bell Scott is also an artist quite well represented in Oxford. He painted the well-known poet and writer Charles Algernon Swinburne, and there's a portrait of him there. Swinburne, of course, an important figure in life in Oxford. And there's an example of a Pre-Raphaelite landscape by Bell Scott as well. And we have two marvellous landscapes of the Protestant graveyard in Rome by Bell Scott, which in the Ashmolean Museum. This painting on the lower left is of Ailsa Craig, from the Isle of Arran, I believe. And yes, again, an artist working under the influence of John Ruskin. And Ruskin's writings we're going to be considering at another talk later in this series on modern painters. But his influence upon the artistic life of the city can't be underestimated. If we go to Exeter College Chapel, we come across this marvellous Morrison Company tapestry, Star of Bethlehem, based on the Edward Burne-Jones design for it. And this is a really excellent example of Burne-Jones's later work. Could be used as a Christmas card. I know Michael and I have admired this when we've been to a concert in the chapel. And it is certainly a terrific work. And it shows all of the skill of Burne-Jones and the Morris and Company, bringing back something of the early Flemish tapestries to Pre-Raphaelitism. So in fact, fulfilling a lot of the early promise of the Pre-Raphaelites, and bringing something of Rossetti's great sense of design and pattern, which comes through, is mediated through Morris and Burne-Jones, into something that is entirely new within British art. And this is a fine example of it, the Star of Bethlehem. Now, if you were just to travel a little bit out of the city and we go to Buscott Park, we can come and see one of the best series of Burne-Jones paintings just outside Oxford, the Legend of the Briar Rose. And there, that collection, you can see this wonderful series of late Burne-Jones paintings. Absolutely exquisite room, the Briar Rose room. I would certainly recommend that. So it's within striking distance of Oxford. And also, if you were to go to Buscott Church, you will also see some wonderful windows by Burne-Jones and Morris there, which are very, very good examples of Morris and Company work. And one can almost feel the presence of those two great men there, such is the power of their work. But not all the Pre-Raphaelites, the early Pre-Raphaelites, lost touch with Oxford. Holman Hunt was to return in the 1890s with his famous painting, May Morning on Magdalen Tower. I've shown this one before on the talk that I gave on Holman Hunt specifically. On the left is the famous Tower of Magdalen College, and every May morning to sing in the coming of the rising of the sun, we have the choristers and the people from Magdalen College climb the tower and sing. And Hunt chose to paint this particular view, and this is the painting on the top right hand is the Birmingham version, which is also in a shield type design by Holman Hunt as well. And there's an invitation to see the picture below it. There is Magdalen Tower in the May sunshine. I photographed that one myself one May morning. And that is the painting itself from the Lady Lever Art Gallery in Port Sunlight in Liverpool. And there you can see, this is a late work by Holman Hunt, perhaps his last great painting. Here it takes on the form of a procession, so it looks to the art of medieval processional painting. It has this tremendous sense of rhythm and power to it. So we've got the swallows swirling in one direction, the clouds going in another, the choristers. We can almost hear music coming from this painting, and the study of light is tremendous. It's a large painting, much larger than the Birmingham version, and we get from Magdalen Tower, we get those wonderful views of Oxford and the meadows that surround Oxford. Not then could you see the Cowley car plant, fortunately, you just see meadows and fields out into the far distance. So that really concludes just a taster of what Oxford and what Oxford means to the Pre-Raphaelites and the Pre-Raphaelites mean to Oxford. Certainly Oxford is the second city for the Pre-Raphaelites, and I feel very fortunate to live in a city that where Pre-Raphaelite paintings are so well represented, and where even now, 150 years later, I can still feel the ghosts of Millais and Hunt and Burne-Jones and William Morris stalking these streets.